Well, Dr. Gold, thank you so much for joining us today on Politically Basic. I am really honored to have you on the program.
Thank you so much. It's going to be delightful.
You sure certainly appeared on the scene in a major way. Tell us about how that now famous press conference came about.
Yes, as you mentioned, I am an experienced emergency physician. I used to say board certified emergency physician, but in 22, I let my board certification go because the medical industrial complex really isn't doing right by patients or doctors. In the COVID years in 2020, on the front lines in the emergency rooms, I directly observed that what was happening on the ground with patients in doctors' offices and in the hospitals was completely different than what our government public officials were saying and what the media was saying. This was very, very upsetting. It took me a few months to piece it together, but after reading the journals and seeing the patients in the ER, I I couldn't be silent anymore. You know, our government was saying things like there's no early treatment available, saying things like stay home. Remember that phrase, shelter in place?
Mm.
Shelter in place. Schools were closed, 6 foot social distancing, paper cloths over your face. All of that was false, not scientific, and invalid, inaccurate. So I gathered up other frontline doctors like myself, and we formed kind of a coalition, became known as America's Frontline Doctors. And in the summer of 2020, we stood on the steps of the Supreme Court and we told the world and Americans, don't be afraid, stop with the fear mongering. If you want early treatment, we can show you how to get that. And most important, not to live in fear. And we were fighting for people's really constitutionally guaranteed rights. For example, as an attorney, I can tell you, we don't have any law in America that allows the government to lock down healthy citizens. There is a police power that different states have to quarantine the sick, but you cannot lock down healthy citizens. And quite frankly, sheltering in place or non-essential jobs is quarantining healthy people. So that was our fight. That was our mission. And I'm very proud because I've been told many times over the years that that moment kind of changed things for people. People, you know, they kind of felt something was off with what the government was saying, but they didn't know quite what. And so, you know, we were able to really put those doctors in front of the American people. And for me, that will always remain a very special moment.
Well, we're sure glad that you did that. I mean, COVID was such a scenario that really rocked our nation in a lot of ways, and it exposed a lot too. And so much is coming out now, just sort of as we are transitioning out of a Biden administration, in which we really saw a federal government use this to control and not listen to medical professionals. It was really quite surprising, and I'm sure you're feeling a lot of vindication now on the back end of this as almost weekly information is coming out. Like we're hearing, you know, there was no real data or science driving the 6 foot distancing regulation or the masking of adults and children, that there weren't really strong foundational data points driving those things. What are you experiencing now as this information is coming out to the general public?
Right. So let me just explain to people what happened in the last week or two, last couple of weeks, is that the Congress, the Coronavirus Sub-Select Committee of Congress, came out with a 500-page report, and they went over all of the data points that we were told as Americans and people across the world. Things like masks have to be worn to stop the transmission of viral particles. Things like the shots that they were selling stop transmission of the virus between people. Things like social distancing, having to stand 6 feet apart. Things like the virus coming from a lab or being manufactured with gain of function research. I'm trying to remind people these were all things that we were told in 2020 were false. But we frontline doctors knew forever that masks do not keep out tiny respiratory viruses that are the size zero point 0.1 micron in size, which is 1/1000th the size of a hair. We knew that the 6 foot social distancing had no science or magic to it. What it did do, though, is it forced the schools to close because really almost no schools could had enough space where children's desks could be 6 feet apart. It was specifically chosen, in my opinion, so that schools would be kept closed. We saw that the teachers' unions acted very badly. They didn't pay any priority to the children. They really were only looking out for their own financial interest. We all heard that we knew the shots, for example, came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. And everyone who was mocked, the first person I know who said that was Senator Cotton in February of 2020, and people mocked him. Now, what I really want to remind people is that even though Congress came out with this big report in December of 24, America's frontline doctors were saying these things as early as April of 2020. I remind people of that not so much to pat myself on the back, although it would be nice if people ever apologized for calling us, crazy, but because this information was knowable. It was certainly knowable to people in the government. If I, an ordinary bedside clinician, could find this, by some internet sleuthing, then surely our government knew what they were doing when they were lying to us. It's very, very upsetting. And it's hard for me, quite frankly, to forgive this because it could not have been by accident. And there were a lot of deaths due to it. And as people know, the shots had many harmful side effects, not only health side effects such as clots, which is unquestioned, and myocarditis, but also people lost their jobs or people were forced into kind of a tyrannical situation. They couldn't travel, couldn't see grandma, all of that. And we have to answer for that as a nation. Kyle, I think that if we don't look this square in the eye and say our government did wrong and what will we do different going forward, we won't really protect ourselves from this happening again in the future. So I am grateful that Congress came out with this committee hearing, a committee report, but we have to look the squirrel in the eye and not let it happen again.
Oh, you're so right. And just having gone through this holiday season recently, there's been a lot of activities, particularly on social media, of doing just that. People reminding Americans of, hey, remember just a few short years ago when you couldn't get together and gather as a family for Thanksgiving or for Christmas. You couldn't sing Christmas carols. Remember, they tried to ban singing and all of these horrible things going on. And it is so important to remember what we went through.
Yeah, and it was done with a lot of hate. If you go back and you look at videos of news reporters and even honestly, Fauci, who's supposed to be a dispassionate doctor, there was so much vitriol. Was it Jimmy Kimmel? There were different late night hosts who said, we don't really care if the unvaccinated die and the unvaccinated are killing grandma. And it was just such a huge amount of hate from American to American. It was very upsetting. That's why we need to look the squirrel in the eye so that we can move past it, because the hatred from American to American was very unsettling. I'm sure you felt that as well.
Yeah, people were vilified. The anti-vaxxers became the villains of this story. And it was just so many people had questions. It all happened really fast. There was a lot of fear. And of course, you're going to have questions about something that you're injecting into your body. It was just a really concerning time. I want to ask you, do you now, seeing that everything that you knew as the, experienced, brilliant person that you are, you knew it then, it's coming out to be true now, what you knew in 2020. Do you believe the narrative that this was politically motivated as a benefit to the 2020 presidential election?
I remember when we were standing on the steps of the Supreme Court in July of 2020, and somebody said to me, well, I think they're doing this to mess with the 2020 election in November. And I remember thinking, oh, no way. That's crazy. I mean, it was months away. I couldn't process it. But yes, in retrospect, certainly after the election in 2020, it was very obvious that there had to have been another motive. It wasn't just to sell vaccines, for example. It wasn't just to benefit pharmaceutical companies financially. There's no way. So I definitely think it was to mess with the 2020 election. I actually am horrified that actually happened. Not for the obvious corrupt reasons, but because the thing had gone on for so long. And if you had let this respiratory illness, this SARS-2 virus, run its natural course, it hit America around January, I'm guessing, of 2020, January 2020. By November 2020, we wouldn't even been talking about it anymore. So I was horrified on so many levels as an American citizen, but also just as a physician. that politics had interfered so much with the ordinary practice of medicine that we were still talking about this virus for 3 years. I was recently invited to another nation, and it was to recap, to give a talk, and it was to kind of recap what we had gone through COVID and how we go forward. And that nation had not done. They said we haven't talked about COVID for 3 years. Do you understand? Like, some nations didn't go through what we did as a nation. And so I just feel, Kyle, that we need to reflect upon this. And I think that the new leadership coming in January, Bobby Kennedy and President Trump, need to really address this directly. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya will be in charge of NIH. We just need to not sweep it under the rug.
Absolutely. There are still efforts to push the COVID vaccine even today. Do you think that it is reasonable that anyone would still be taking the vaccine at this point?
Yeah. It is completely irrational to take the COVID shots. I don't know if I can say it more clearly. It is completely irrational to take the COVID shots. Many reasons for that. One reason is the shot is chasing its tail. The newest version of the shot is not catching up with the variants that are out there. There's mutations that keep mutating. Number two, it's been clear from day one that SARS-2 as a virus can certainly make the very frail people with 4 comorbid conditions, heart disease, lung disease, out of control diabetes, for example, can make those people very, very sick, but it does not make other people critically ill. So you don't need any kind of pre-protection for that. And number three, it's very clear that we have cheap, safe, generic medicines that work very well against SARS-2, specifically hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which I couldn't say on air for about 2.5 years.
It's crazy that, again, you guys are being vindicated. People were talking about it like it was some really fringe out there experimental medicine to take to combat this, and now everyone's like, yeah, safe to take, you should take that, this is the first thing that we're going to recommend that you take if you haven't. Everything's done a 180 since 2020. It's just remarkable.
By the way, it's very disheartening to me as a physician to see how quickly physicians collapsed on these issues. Hydroxychloroquine, at the time COVID struck, had been around in America, FDA approved, for about 65 or 75 years. Ivermectin, which our FDA mocked as horse medicine, had won the Nobel Prize in human medicine in 2015. It's that great a drug. So I cannot believe how quickly doctors just gave into the propaganda.
Yeah, that's a whole other element, I think, that was going on with this, was their loyalty, maybe not as much to their patients as to other entities. I mean, I knew people trying to get ivermectin from Mexico, and there were other countries that were like, what's the problem up there in the States? This is effective, and they knew it. Here's a basic question for you, Dr. Gold. The flu vaccine that we're used to getting the flu shot, or a lot of people are, every winter, every fall. Is that a good idea? And doesn't the flu shot just protect kind of more generally against some of these variants? Or what's your take on the flu shot as an alternative or a way to protect against some of these variants coming down?
So my opinion has changed a lot since the COVID years. I've done a lot more research. Now, I was labeled as anti-vax when the whole COVID vaccine story started. But in full disclosure, all of my life and all of my career, I had every vaccine that I was required to or suggested to. And frankly, I didn't think about it. I've got 2 kids. They also had every shot that their pediatrician recommended. So I had no dog in this fight. I wasn't anti-vax. It just wasn't something I really paid attention to. But let me share with you what I noticed as an emergency physician for 25 years. Virtually every single patient I ever admitted into the hospital with influenza had taken the influenza vaccine. I just noticed that. So my professional opinion, all of my career, was that this is a very ineffective vaccine because everyone had taken it who still got admitted to the hospital with influenza. So that's what I knew from my experience. You can't shake someone's own direct experience, and I have that. After COVID, and I saw what huge lies were being said by powerful people with a lot of vested interest, I looked at the influenza shot, And no, I would not take the influenza vaccine. Many reasons. One is, like I said before, the COVID shot, it kind of is chasing its tail. I did know that as a physician, that we're always kind of trying to guess ahead of time which variant's going to be popular that season or dominant that season. And some years the scientists get it a little more right. A lot of times they get a little more wrong. They just have to kind of predict when they're making the vaccine 6 to 8 months ahead of time what's going to be the dominant strain that season. So it's just not very effective. Number two, and this is, I think, more disturbing and perhaps explains why most people admitted into the hospital had taken the shot. And that's after about I think it's on the third year of taking an annual influenza vaccine, you actually are more likely to come down with influenza. I certainly did not know that when I was practicing medicine clinically. So I would never take the influenza shot. I leave it to everybody to discuss with their own physician, their own personal risk assessment. But for me and patients that I see, I do not recommend it.
Wow. I'm really glad to hear your take on that. And your experience is vast. So thank you for sharing that wisdom. You know, you mentioned RFK Jr. being attached to this presidential administration and his really exposure of what's been going on in our country with regard to the foods that we're eating, the medicines that we're taking, and what kind of has been going on with this monopoly of the pharmaceutical companies. One thing that's come out recently that's been very just kind of smack you in the face, shocking, is seeing the childhood vaccine schedule now compared to just, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years ago. The list used to be quite short and I might say manageable for children. And now it's just horrifically long. When you look at it in its totality, it's quite scary to think about a baby or a small child going through that. What's your take on the childhood vaccine schedule now and maybe some efforts coming down the pipeline to make it more reasonable or more effective?
Right. There's so many issues at play here. So first of all, if this is an area you're not versed in, when you think of childhood vaccines, you're thinking of the traditional measles, mumps, rubella, polio, and there's issues with those. But you're thinking of that, and there was, in my childhood, I think there was about 7 total. Now in 2024, there's 72 between birth and age 18. So first off, the volume, the number has exploded. Why has it exploded? You can decide for yourself when I give you these facts. In 1986, our Congress voted to make sure that vaccine manufacturers were shielded from all liability. This is a pro and a con. The pro is that the industry said, gosh, we need this protection because otherwise it's not cost effective for us to create vaccines. The con is when you remove the fact of having the manufacturer be responsible for the safety of its product, the manufacturer is simply not going to make the product that safe. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to understand that if you can be sued for something, you're going to work really, really hard to make sure it's critically safe. So we, as American citizens, through our United States representatives, we voted this policy into place that has led to 72 shots being on the childhood vaccine schedule. So one of the things that Bobby Kennedy Jr. has said that he really wants to tackle is to remove the liability shield. In other words, make the vaccine manufacturer be liable for the products that they're putting out into the marketplace. We do that with everything. Cars, you can sue Mercedes-Benz or BMW or Ford if they make a malfunctioning car. We need to be able to sue for poor quality products, even if the vaccines are safe for 98% of humans or 99% of humans. When you're giving a medicine to hundreds of millions of people, basically your entire population, 1% of that is a huge number. And I also want to remind people that we give vaccines to healthy people. The personal risk assessment a person makes when they're healthy is vastly different than if they're sick. What do I mean? If you have cancer, for example, you are willing to take a higher risk for an experimental treatment or treatment that may not be perfectly safe because you know that you're in jeopardy with no treatment. But if you're perfectly healthy, you're destined to go on perfectly healthy. And your personal risk assessment is like, hey, I don't want to take that thing unless I'm 100% sure that that thing is safe. So I want to get vaccines very close to 100% safety. I want to make the vaccine manufacturers pay for when it's not perfectly safe and compensate people, and also not gaslight them that, they didn't get the injury from the shot when they did. So there's a lot of issues going on here.
And isn't it, well, you tell us, is it even safe and healthy to administer 72 vaccines to a human during their child, during their young years? It seems like such an enormous amount of chemicals and medical components going into a young, small body.
Right. So I do think there comes a time when you look at a number like this and you say, oh my gosh, this really seems insane, right? So we know that the vaccines have a lot of additives. We know that the vaccine manufacturers have been given a liability shield. We know that the vaccine manufacturers, even with the liability shield, that money has been paid out from pharmaceutical companies to patients for injuries. We know that, for example, it was Sanofi, this was abroad, this was in the Philippines, have put out a vaccine for dengue fever, which was, I think, the leading cause of death for children under 3 or under 4 years old. So they put it out, but it killed a lot of babies. We know those things for sure. We know that our manufacturing companies, honestly, like companies we think we love, like Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer, have paid out billions of dollars in medication side effects, adverse events, right? Those are facts. So the question remains, 72 shots by vaccine manufacturers that are shielded from liability. Yeah, no. I'm going to go with no. That's a hard no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of children and what their bodies can handle, and our responsibility as adults, and for our legislators to be extra cautious about what we're doing to children in this country. It's been a real debate around the trans issue and topic. And now the UK has just banned puberty blockers for minors. We've got a case in front of the Supreme Court having to do with the process of transitioning and medications for minors. Along this conversation of what's best and healthiest for bodies that are small and still developing and getting 72 currently vaccines pumped into them. What is your take on this and the transitioning of minors and puberty blockers and that type of medication on a young body?
Right. So you're talking about what the world is calling, quote, gender affirming care. Gender affirming care is when you take a person who believes themselves to be the opposite sex, and the doctor affirms that, yes, indeed, they are the opposite sex, and let's do these medical treatments to make your body more similarly relate or appear like the opposite sex. So let's break this down. First of all, what is gender? Until about 20 years ago, the word gender only applied to nouns, like in Romance languages and Latin languages. It didn't apply to someone's biological sex. So we've gotten very confused over about 20 years, and we are now conflating the word sex and gender. As a medical fact, there are only 2 biological sexes. And in the short way of thinking about it is all mammals, of which humans are one, are oriented towards building a certain type of gamete, which is your reproductive system. All mammals are oriented towards creating a male reproductive system or a female reproductive system. This almost always matches a person's chromosomes, either XY for male or XX for female. Rarely there's a chromosomal abnormality, very uncommon, where someone might end up with XXY or XYY or XO, etc. But if there's any portion of the Y chromosome in that mammal will be developing towards a male reproductive system. I start there because people are believing lies that there is a range of sexes. There is not. There's only 2. That's it. The reason this is so important is that if a child or an adult goes to a physician and says, hey, I feel like, even though I'm a woman, I feel like a man. And the doctor says to them, no problem, we can turn you into a man. That is a lie. It is impossible. What they could do is they could offer surgical procedures and hormone manipulation that makes a male body look sort of closer to a female body and give hormones in that direction. The problem is this is mutilating a healthy body. This causes males to have to be left with chronic open wounds that they need to constantly, when I say constantly, multiple times per day, manipulate that wound just to stay open. It causes females to, it causes both sexes actually to have lifelong difficulty with sexual pleasure. Don't mean to be too blunt, but the ability to orgasm evaporates for almost all of these people. It causes lifelong sterility when you start giving hormones to children. And when I say sterility, what I mean is after 2 years of being on hormones, if you're young, after 2 years of being on puberty blockers in your youth, if you don't allow the child to go naturally through puberty, that person will never be able to develop sperm or egg. So when I say sterility, it's not the kind of sterility that you could later reverse with like in vitro fertilization or things like that. It's a permanent loss of making sperm or making eggs. So when you hear the medical facts, you say to yourself, whoa, how could you possibly offer this to children who cannot possibly understand what it's like to forever forego the opportunity to be a parent, to forever forego the opportunity to breastfeed, to forever forego sexual pleasure in their life, let alone chronic medical wounds and lifelong medical dependency. So America's Frontline Doctors speaks out very strongly on this issue and says you cannot offer these procedures and hormones to minors. We call it medical mutilation because it's mutilating healthy bodies, and we'll fight it aggressively as long as I've got breath.
Wow. Well, that's science that you can rely on right there. Thank you for breaking that down for us. You know, I've been digging into this case that is before the Supreme Court about this. It's generating out of Tennessee. And yeah, the way that it is being explained, it's really coming from a very emotional standpoint. A child who says that he's going through what was the word? Nightmarish puberty and a lot of difficulty in puberty. And of course, the parents are sympathetic. You know, we are a compassionate nation. We care about our children. We don't want to see them suffering. But it seemed to me after reading through a lot of this information and myself having sympathy for this family and this child, of course, that the response is a drastic overreach to solving the problem. Puberty is difficult for most people, and you don't solve a difficult puberty experience with transitioning and pumping a body full of puberty blockers and chemicals and cutting body parts off that's going to lead to everlasting, you know, it's just real physical, mental, emotional devastation. I'd love your opinion on kind of what's driving this effort in our country. Are there incentives in the medical community or for clinics? I think I have read something, and I don't know if that's correct or not, incentives for them to be doing these types of procedures or pushing these types of drugs. What do you think is the driving force here for right. doing this to children?
Right. So this is a social contagion. Let's start with, it's not possible from a medical perspective that all of these children have suddenly shown up with what used to be called gender identity disorder. There's a social contagion aspect going on. It's specifically afflicting female teenagers, and it is usually carried through like YouTube videos and online social affirmation and attention in a setting usually where the child has other distress. So one thing I learned in the last couple of years is that about 70% of these children that end up having these procedures have another psychiatric diagnosis of either autism, anxiety, or depression. So that fact alone should give you pause. So what is going on here is that we are treating a psychological problem with a physiological solution, which of course can never work. we have a lot of compassion for people who are in this situation at any age. So if a full-grown adult is in the situation, there needs to be treated with compassion, and all the more so for a young person. Most of the young people who are being diagnosed with gender dysphoria, if you leave them alone, if you leave their bodies alone, I should say, if you don't medically mutilate or hormonally interfere with their normal growth, the overwhelming majority, and I'm saying over 90%, will get through this gender dysphoria. And in their 20s, they no longer have discomfort with their gender. They still might have their psychiatric issues like anxiety or depression or autism, et cetera, but they can come through the gender dysphoria phase if you leave their bodies alone. So you ask what the motive is. There's a huge political movement of activists that want to bring more and more people into this. And I use very harsh language for them. I call them trans predators. Those are people who get some kind of gain from bringing more and more of these miserable, medically mutilated bodies to the forefront. And secondarily, and a second motivation is that each child who goes through these procedures and hormonal manipulations is worth about $1 million per child over their lifetime to the medical industrial complex. There's a lot of money at stake.
Oh, it's so sick. I mean, who can live with themselves doing that to a child for financial gain? But that's something I don't understand.
There's so much more to this. Most of the practitioners who are engaged in this, I shouldn't say most, I have no way of knowing most. Many of the practitioners who engage in this have, when you look back into their personal history, they have a lot of gender dysphoria issues on their own. So it seems to me that they are very cavalierly spreading essentially this kind of disease from their own psyche that they're now spreading out. There's many, many doctors who do these surgeries that clearly suffer from gender dysphoria themselves. So we need to stop it. We, America's Frontline Doctors, filed an amicus brief in that Supreme Court you mentioned, the Scrimeti case. It will be resulted in June. The state of Tennessee stood up for children in this case and said, we're not allowing this for minors. And we'll see what the Supreme Court says. I think the Supreme Court is going to agree that the state can stop this.
Yeah, that's the legal consensus that I'm hearing as well. And not only that they're going to stop it, but there's going to be an even more powerful pushback because this has been brought before them. Do you think that we're kind of in line, similar to the UK, in starting to ban some of these puberty blockers and procedures?
Yes, so that's a really important point. So the United Kingdom studied this issue for the last 3 to 4 years, and they put a very prominent physician whose last name is Cass, C-A-S-S, in charge of the analysis. And in early 2024, Dr. Cass came out with this report called the Cass Report, and they found that, of course, these things are not beneficial and they're overall appear to be harmful. So following that Cass report, where Dr. Cass was really attacked, a lot of things happened, though. It ended up closing down the largest transgender clinic in the United Kingdom. And I think it might be the largest one in the world. It's called Tavistock. So the Tavistock clinic being closed is huge. The activist organization WPATH lost more than 60% of its members over the past year, partly because they said it was okay to do these mutilating procedures with no lower age limit. I mean, I don't know of a 5-year-old who's gone through this, but they refuse to put any lower age limits in. And the third variable that's coming up is there's a lot of detransitioners who are speaking up and are saying, the doctors never even told me that if I just sat tight on this issue, it might pass, which we know to be true. So I'm actually very optimistic that we'll turn the corner on this, but we have to have so much compassion for the patients who are misled by doctors. And frankly, Kyle, I want to see some doctors go to prison for years for what they've done.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out through the legal system. You mentioned WPATH. Can you just explain for the audience what that is and what they're doing? What are they in charge of?
WPATH was a professional organization, I think, for about 25 or 30 years now. But over the last 15 years, I would say, they've been, this is my opinion, they've been hijacked by activists. They are no longer a professional organization like of doctors, but they're an organization that is really activist and aggressive in its orientation towards saying that children should have these procedures. And when I say children should have these procedures, what I mean is they push for legislation where if the doctor even talks about another path, such as psychotherapy and analysis and family counseling, and let's treat your anxiety and let's treat your depression, that those doctors in those states, like Colorado, for example, or California, can lose their medical license. So the activists are so gung ho about the surgery and the hormone that they are threatening doctors by saying you can lose your license if you don't offer these horrific treatments. So that is WPATH, and WPATH is, I believe, on the decline, on the severe decline. Like I said, 60% of its membership walked away over the past about 1.5 years.
Gosh, such an interesting time right now with so much going on. Trump 2.0 coming in. We have this MAHA movement now, Make America Healthy Again. A lot of excitement around that. People, I think, are breathing a sigh of relief. Like finally, someone's going to look into all this and get us healthy again. What do you predict is going to happen? What are we going to see over this next year with the new administration coming in? RFK Jr. looking to make things healthier. The referendum on big pharma. What's going to happen to Dr. Fauci? What do you think? I'd love your take on all this.
I love it. I'll close it with my closing thoughts on the transgender issue, which is it's such a complex issue, but so fascinating. It's such a hugely important issue for Americans to really understand that America's Frontline Doctors, we made a movie. We just released it. It's called What is a Doctor? And it's very explosive. And we actually lay out exactly what's happening, who's benefiting from this financially, and we name names. Where did this movement come from? What the doctors are doing in response to this, how families are coping, what you can do if you find yourself in that situation. So if you are willing, if you want to be more educated on this and really be shocked, whatisthedoctor.org. I believe related to that President Trump has clearly said that he's going to tackle this issue. Senator Roger Marshall, United States Senator Roger Marshall, who's a doctor, just put a bill in front of the Senate, the STOP Act, which is to stop these mutilating procedures. And if doctors or hospitals do these procedures, they could be fined $100,000 per incident. So I think that the transgender issue, I think we're going to grab a hold of it and kind of put a stop to it. In terms of MAHA, isn't it exciting to live in a time when it was the platform of a major presidential candidate, Bobby Kennedy I'm talking about, to actually prioritize the health of Americans? In my lifetime, that's never existed. We've never said that that was as important as war or military or healthcare expenses. We've never said that before. So it is just so exciting that we're living in a time when that candidate who couldn't go all the way because of political shenanigans in the Democrat Party, but is now having a very important position in the incoming Trump administration. And I believe, because I know him, that he's going to fight very hard to make America healthy again. What do I mean? He has spent 25 to 30 years bucking the system, going against powerful people, paying the price personally, paying the price politically. He was a Kennedy, for goodness sakes, and that most of the Kennedys turned their back on him. This is not a man who's going to forget why he's there, what he's sent to do. He has a strong belief. I've worked with him over the past 4 years. He has a strong understanding and belief that the pharmaceutical industry needs to come to heel. Not to say that we can't use good pharmaceuticals, but they have to be tested. They have to be vetted. It usually is not the root cause. You're usually not doing a root cause analysis why the patient needs the medicine. Doctors are usually just writing a script. So he wants to examine the food. He wants to examine the usefulness of these medicines. I couldn't be more excited as a doctor for what, I think is going to happen over the next few years.
It is really thrilling, actually. Everybody wants to feel better and not be so dependent on these medications and have so many health issues. So really looking forward to seeing him unleashed on this sector of our day-to-day lives. You mentioned Dr. Bhattacharya also. Trump has just nominated for director of NIH, the National Institute of Health. You're excited for this pick. Tell us about that.
So over the last 4.5 years or 5 years, I think I've gotten to know almost every doctor in the freedom space. So, and of course, Bobby Kennedy is not a doctor. But Dr. Bhattacharya is a very fine person. He's an ethical, honorable person. He's also curious. I mentioned at the top of the show that I was very disheartening to see the doctors just go along with what propagandists had to say. Dr. Bhattacharya wasn't like that. He was always curious. Is this right? Is this wrong? And the other quality that he displayed was courage. He's a professor at Stanford. That was my alma mater. And it was really difficult to get academic doctors to buck their academic institution. And while he didn't go as far as, let's say, I did, he, in his lane of academic medicine, he went pretty far. He was an author of the Barrington Declaration, which called lockdowns, what they were. They were harmful, dangerous, unhealthy, likely unconstitutional strategies that our government deployed. And he was very important in shedding light on the lockdown issue. So I'm sharing with you that I know him to be a person of courage, integrity, and curiosity. And so I think that bodes well for our NIH, which right now is misspending a lot of money. The NIH funded this gain of function research that led to the SARS-2 virus. So it's a really big job. It's a really important job. I will say that just running HHS in totality is probably going to be the hardest job that any secretary has. I mean, there's a lot of difficult situations across the world. There's military and defense and homeland and all of these things. But HHS is so big. It covers the NIH, it covers the CDC, it covers the FDA, it covers Medicare, CMS. So each one of those agencies are multi-billion-dollar agencies. So Bhattacharya is head of one, but Kennedy is going to have to be in charge of all of it. It's a big job.
It's a really big job. We were just talking about the FDA yesterday. And where are they on some of these ingredients that are now being exposed to be so harmful? And somebody, just Kellogg has gotten a lot of blowback since, Kennedy has come on to this administration. And just looking at these ingredients, it's like, where have you been? What have you been doing? So I think, NIH is also very indicative, I think, of a lot of government agencies, a lot of federal agencies that are now going to be kind of tipped over and shaken out, and people like Dr. Bhattacharya who are going to come in and say, what's been going on, and ask why, which we love here at Politically Basic, of course, what we're trying to do. It's just going to be a really, really great and exciting 4 years, I think, of getting these agencies cleaned out and see what's going on and making them better. So I think there's a lot of hopefulness around that right now.
Yeah, I want to share something just to kind of a different way to look about it. Like something like an agency like the FDA, so Food and Drug Administration, they have defined their job in the drug category as determining if a drug is safe and effective. I want to suggest to the American people that I don't even want the FDA to do that. I would like the FDA to continue ascertaining if drugs are safe. I think that that is a valid role for a government of 350 million people. But I think that effectiveness of a drug should be left to the marketplace, should be left to doctors to trial medications and figure it out. That's why all medications, once they're approved and on the market, doctors can use them for any reason. They don't have to limit their use only to the reason for which they've been approved. But what if the FDA was only in charge of safety, not of efficacy, effectiveness? That is something that could make it a little less complicated for the FDA, and I think be a boon to Americans. If you remember, they said that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine shouldn't be used because they weren't effective. They couldn't argue with its safety profile. So I suggest we should remove that effectiveness away from the FDA in terms of drug safety, and just focus on drug safety. And then, of course, the other part, which is the food. And we'll see what Kennedy does about that.
That's a really smart idea. I hope that everyone's listening to you because you have a lot of really brilliant wisdom to share. When the pandemic hit, there was a government/mainstream media effort to message a lot of things. You can call it propaganda. I think a lot of it was. But we heard over and over to trust the science. And then here we are 3-4 years later, and they were not right. The scientists, a lot of them weren't right. Some were. They were categorized, just like you said, as, conspiracy theorists or nut jobs, and, told to go take their tinfoil hats elsewhere. And they were all right. And this trust the science experts were wrong. So how do you think we move forward as a nation, but really everyone? How do we move forward in
Right.
being able to discern truthful medical information?
So this is a huge problem. You hit it precisely. It's extremely difficult to find trustworthy information. So I don't even know if you know, but we started a business to address this exact problem. You need free market solutions for people. So there's goldcare.com. My last name is Gold, Dr. Gold, goldcare.com. And at goldcare.com, which is national telemedicine, you can find all the doctors and all the experts, naturopaths, functional doctors, allopathic doctors, nutritionists, all of that. And you have a free marketplace of ideas, and you can talk with these people and determine for yourself once you're given access to the information. A lot of things went wrong during the COVID years. Most spectacularly was we lost our ability to speak freely. Yes, it is true that the government, for its own reasons, was putting out very biased scientific information. But if we had had free speech, we could have kind of balanced that. We could have also put out the accurate information. The accurate information, Kyle, was there. It was just suppressed. If it wasn't there, I could not have figured it out myself. But everyone was being taken off of social media. I mean, every freedom doctor I knew, everyone, I can't think of any, was not banned from Twitter and Facebook. So this is the square place. This is the town square. Thank God Elon Musk bought Twitter. It changed everything. Thank God Elon's going to be working with the president. It's not just Doge. I think he's very focused on free speech. And so, yes, there is propaganda, but I think we can overcome the propaganda with free speech. And the distrust that the American people have for doctors is real, it's valid, and it's literally why we built goldcare.com. Most doctors these days are working for not the patient, they're working for the government, or they're working for a large insurance company. The answer is complicated, but in my father's day, 85% of doctors were self-employed. And today, 85% of doctors work for somebody else. Well, you cannot serve two masters. If your real employer is the hospital system or Blue Cross Blue Shield, because they pay you most of the money, you as a patient are going to be left out in the cold when it serves the government or the insurer's interest to tell you something different. And that's exactly what happened. Wow. Go to goldcare.com. You'll get unbiased doctors who are not bought and paid for by insurance companies or pharmaceutical companies.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for starting that, and I hope everybody goes to that website to check out those resources. Over the last year, particularly, I think personally, because it was a presidential election year, every now and again in the news, another virus or another pandemic scare would pop up. Like, get ready, here comes another variant. And then pretty quickly it was dismissed and nobody paid much attention. Should we be paying attention now? I think we're also burned and we have PTSD from COVID-19. Are we taking any of these seriously? And what do you think? Are we having the right response? And just like, no, we don't want to go down that path again.
These are kind of tricky philosophical questions, because it is certainly possible that a virus could come along that's problematic. However, overwhelmingly, what does people in most viruses of bacteria most of the time has to do with your underlying health. There were many lies during COVID. One of them was that everybody was at equal risk. That is a huge foundational lie that was sold to the American public so that they could have this other things that they wanted, which is like selling the shots, closing the schools, all of that. It was never true that people are at equal risk. If you are over 75 or 85, really pretty old, and had 4 comorbid conditions, you are at pretty high risk. If you were young or healthy, middle-aged, or even older but healthy, you were not at risk. So the main thing is to keep an eye on is to be generally healthy. And second is to have access to good advice. So you should find out if this is something to worry about or not. So to stay generally healthy and to get good advice, not meaning to keep selling it, but the only place I know of where you can do that is nationally is goldcare.com.
Yeah, that's really great wisdom. You have so much good wisdom to share. I just want to ask you a really open question as we start to wrap up today. And that is, what do you want to share with people that you don't always get a chance to say, just generally?
So interesting. So I think what was very disheartening over the last few years as a doctor was that I was so proud of the knowledge I had gained in medical school residency and all of my years of practice. And I learned during COVID that actually I had only been shown half the menu. If you walk into a restaurant, there's the, appetizers and drinks, and there's the entrees and desserts. So you really expect to see all of that. But really in medical school, we were taught a lot and taught very well in biochemistry and pathology of diseases and pharmacology. And we were absolutely taught that very well. What we were not taught was how to stay well, how to maintain your health. We were taught virtually nothing about nutrition, which is, in retrospect, shocking. And I am sorry that the average doctor that's put before the average American has been so ill-informed, and simultaneously that we were so trained as a people to put our trust in the experts. We have to wind back both of those things. We have to step back from outsourcing our thinking. We don't outsource our thinking to this degree in other areas. And I would suggest we shouldn't so outsource it in the medical either. And simultaneously, we have to teach doctors better. To do that, you have to kind of remove the other incentives, the financial incentives that are kind of biasing them a certain way. But I really want to share that. For example, not only do we not learn about nutrition or wellness techniques to keep patients healthy, we completely ignore the spiritual, not to get all, sappy here, but we are mind, body, and soul. It's all connected. And we know as doctors that a person's attitude or belief in something like the placebo effect is absolutely valid. It absolutely matters to their getting well. So why are we so reluctant to share that with our patients? One of the things we do at Cold Care, I said from the very beginning, is we started with a spiritual basis, because we know that a person's mental health and attitude towards their physical health will have a great impact on how healthy they are, and can they come off medications, or et cetera. So I want to share with you that there's a lot to be optimistic about, a lot to be excited about. And in fact, I am very excited and happy to move forward in the medical space. And I think that it's a new day.
I'll agree with that. So well said. Thank you. And there's so much more to talk about. I do hope that you will join me again on the show another time to keep digging into these basics. It's absolutely fascinating. You're brilliant. I hope you're feeling so fully vindicated after everything that you have gone through. And I just want to affirm your courage and bravery over these last 4 years, Dr. Gold, in what you have done for this country and the people in it. And I want to thank you for that too. Thank you for those efforts.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. Thank you.
And definitely check out goldcare.com and whatisadoctor.org. Did I get that one right?
Perfect.
Yeah. I mean, the buzz around that film is just that it is absolutely outstanding. So congratulations on that. I hope everyone will go check that out and watch it immediately.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.